Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's weekly review with me, Naseem Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, how are you doing?
Hi, Naseem. Good to be with you as always. Thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's lots happened over the week. But we'll begin with the latest development in Sde Teiman detention center. And on top of that, we will discuss the attacks in the Golan Heights over the weekend. We'll do a deep dive on that. And we will examine Hezbollah's denial of any involvement in the attack on Majd al-Shams village. And we'll discuss today also the legal status and the demographic composition of the Golan Heights. I think we've not covered that area as much as I would like to. So we'll do a deep dive on that. And then we will discuss Netanyahu's US Congress address. There's a lot of fanfare around that. And conclude with the latest on the International Criminal Court. But as I said, let's begin with the Israeli military police raiding the Sde Teiman detention center on Monday. 9 soldiers have been detained on suspicion of abusing Palestinian detainees. This is a story we've covered, I think, 2 or 3 times over the last couple of months. So it's related to the notorious prison where hundreds of Palestinians since 7 October have been kept in horrific conditions where they are alleged to have been subjected to sexual abuse, including rape and torture. And it's created quite the arrest, has created quite a political storm in Israel, with many coming out in strong protest against the detention. So what do you think is the real reason for this closure and the detention of Israeli soldiers?
Well, this is a breaking news story from several hours ago, so it's developing as we speak. As you noted, we have discussed the Sde Teiman detention facility in the Negev Desert before, and all indications are, and this is based primarily on testimonies from soldiers who served there, is really that it's kind of a Gestapo camp. And I use that not for dramatic effect, but for purposes of accurate description. We've heard of multiple cases of prisoners having had hands or arms or legs amputated for the simple reason that they have been subjected to very tight what are they called? Those zip ties for weeks on end. Prisoners are not allowed to speak to each other, are not allowed to use the bathrooms. We have heard of multiple cases of unqualified medical students performing surgeries for which they themselves say they were absolutely unqualified on living prisoners as part of their medical education. So they're using live human beings as guinea pigs, akin to medical experiments, I would add. We've heard of multiple cases of the most severe forms of torture. We have seen images of prisoners who have been released. And let's not forget, in the Israeli system, prisoners are only released when the Israeli authorities are 10,000% certain that these prisoners cannot be successfully tried by Israel's military courts that finds 99% of detainees guilty, that they can't legitimately accuse them of anything. Forced confessions by hospital directors. The list really goes on and on. And among the abuses that are known to take place there are rapes of prisoners. Now, what happened this morning is that Israel's military police showed up at this facility to detain 9 soldiers who serve essentially as prison guards in this camp. And the reason they went there is because a prisoner had been taken to the infirmary with severe wounds to his anus and has apparently been gang raped by these nine soldiers. You know, as they say, every accusation is a confession. There were scuffles and clashes between the military police and the soldiers who were being arrested. And just as importantly, arguably more importantly, all hell then broke loose within Israel. Members of parliament went to this facility, Sde Teiman. They called on others to go there, not to support the military police in arresting these presumed gang rapists, but to defend them against the possibility of arrest. And these people were described as heroes, as people doing their jobs. And from an Israeli perspective, I think that's an entirely accurate characterization of these people, because Israel has spent decades, and particularly the past 10 months, thoroughly demonizing each and every Palestinian, particularly those from the Gaza Strip, as human animals, as rapists, as people who put babies in ovens. All of it, of course, false. But it's in this context that these abuses took place. And I can understand at one level the soldiers saying, well, you gave us these orders, and like good Germans, we're doing what you told us to do. You gave us a license to rape, to torture, to kill, because dozens of prisoners have also been tortured to death in this facility. And now you come to hold us responsible while you continue to lead the country. That's unacceptable from the soldiers' perspective. In any event, the military police, who were vociferously denounced by government ministers, by members of Israel's parliament, finally managed to arrest these nine soldiers and take them into detention. And what I find most interesting is that we subsequently had a statement from Israel's chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, not only denouncing the opposition to these arrests, but pointing out that conducting such arrests is essential to defend Israeli soldiers at home and abroad. What does he mean by this? I think it's a critically important aspect of this story. As you know, the chief, or the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, has applied to a panel of judges at the ICC, known as a pretrial chamber, for arrest warrants against a number of Israeli and Palestinian officials. The United Kingdom then, at Israeli and US urging, took the lead in challenging the jurisdiction of the court in this particular case. And to make a long story short, the court then also gave other petitioners the right to challenge its jurisdiction. And among the most important further petitions was one from who else? Germany. And Germany made the absolutely specious argument that there are two reasons that the court should not be considering this case. The first is that, in contrast to any other conflict, no legal investigations or prosecutions should take place while the conflict is ongoing. And the second is that the Germans insisted that we are dealing with a case of complementarity. Complementarity basically means that the International Criminal Court cannot and will not prosecute an official from any state where that state's national legal system is conducting investigations and taking demonstrable steps to put those officials on trial. But the problem with complementarity, as the Germans have presented it, is twofold. First of all, there is no complementarity because every single credible organization, including every major human rights organization, that has looked into the Israeli judiciary when it comes to holding its own personnel accountable for crimes against the Palestinians, has determined that the Israeli investigative apparatus is a sham, it's a fraud, and its primary purpose is to whitewash Israeli crimes rather than to hold those committing those crimes accountable. Second of all, even if that supposition were false, and Israel does have complementarity, according to ICC regulations, you don't just need to have a sound legal system. Your legal system needs to be trying or investigating at least and putting on trial the same individuals who are being charged by the ICC for the same crimes that they are being charged by the ICC. So putting 9 soldiers, arresting them and putting them on trial for gang rape is not going to get either Netanyahu or Galant off for the crimes of starvation and extermination and the others for which the prosecutor is seeking warrants of arrest. And I think that's the real story here, because these things have been happening on a fairly systematic basis in Israel's gulag since October 7th. Nearly 50 that we know of prisoners have died in detention, primarily tortured to death. The Israeli legal system has done nothing. And now all of a sudden we have this incident and further reports that the Israeli military police are examining 48 deaths in detention. You know, these things have been ongoing for a year. All of a sudden there's interest. And I think, as Israel's military chief of staff Halevi confirmed today, the primary purpose of doing so is to protect Israeli soldiers abroad. In other words, to demonstrate complementarity and give ammunition to their bosom buddies, the Germans, to help secure their continued impunity at the International Criminal Court.
You rightly point out that the timing is really suspicious, which is why I'm going to ask the ICC question that I wanted to end with right now. I think it neatly fits into what you were saying. Last week, I think as many as 64 countries, NGOs, and organizations delivered filings to the ICC, amongst which were pro-Israeli organizations like the UK Lawyers for Israel, a number of states, Germany being one of them, who issued Germany being one, but the UK, strangely enough, maybe some actually anticipated this move under the new government of Keir Starmer. They suspended, or they cancelled their challenge to the ICC, which was issued by the previous government. So that's a positive step. But given the large number of filings, 64 in total, most being in support of the ICC, would you then say this is a positive indication that Karim Khan will get the arrest warrant he has been seeking?
No, not at all. And to be clear, and we've discussed this before, Karim Khan has done everything within his power to avoid fulfilling his professional obligations with regard to this case, which is called the situation of Palestine. He dragged his feet for years. When he was left with no choice, he kept the investigation going, and then issued this application for these arrest warrants. And what he, and for that matter, the ICC as an institution are now doing is hiding behind process. Because the ICC already in 2021, before any investigation even commenced, and bear in mind, the ICC's investigation is not about October 7th and what has happened since October 7th. It concerns the entire period since June of 2014 and concerns all actions by relevant actors, not only in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And it also includes investigations into the crime against humanity that is known as apartheid, against a whole panoply of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including settlement policy. But Khan has chosen to focus only on the Gaza Strip and only on the situation on October 7th, 2023. And since, and for good measure, to put his sponsor at ease, has issued 3 arrest applications for Palestinians compared to 2 for Israelis. Now he's hiding behind process. And as I mentioned, his institution is hiding behind process. Why am I saying that? Because the court already in 2021 determined that it had jurisdiction. And now it is accepting challenges to that jurisdiction, which is extremely unusual. And what the British did under their previous government is it challenged jurisdiction on the basis of what is known as the Oslo II Accords, concluded between Israel and the PLO in 1995, in which Israel compelled and succeeded in getting from the Palestinian Authority that Israel has sole criminal jurisdiction over any crimes committed by Israeli citizens in any part of the occupied territories, including those parts that are under the civil and security authority of the Palestinian Authority. And what the British are basically saying is, because of this, the Palestinian Authority does not have the right to transfer jurisdiction to the International Criminal Court over Israelis. It can only do so over Palestinians, and therefore the ICC should only investigate and prosecute Palestinians, but it should continue, as the UK does, provide Israeli criminals with total and unconditional impunity. It's an absolutely absurd argument, as many legal scholars have pointed out, because the ICC has already determined that it has jurisdiction, and the PA, the State of Palestine, as it's known in the ICC, cannot accept only the selective jurisdiction of the ICC. There either is jurisdiction or there isn't, but a situation in which it has only jurisdiction over criminals of one nationality but not criminals of another nationality flies in the face of the most elementary logic. But then on July 4th, the UK had an election. The Tories were thrown out, were replaced by the Tories Light, also known as a Starmer government. And it wasn't until a few days ago, so almost a month after they took office, that the United Kingdom informed the International Criminal Court that it was withdrawing the challenge to the court's jurisdiction. Is that a positive sign? Well, of course it is. But at the same time, the essential role that this UK government played was it held the fort for Israel and the United States, neither of which, of course, are ICC members, but are fundamentally opposed to it having any role in this case. It held the fort until the court decided to accept not only another challenge by Germany, but indeed by any state or organization or individual. And it has so far received over 60 of these. It has set a deadline for August 12th to receive further petitions, either challenging it or supporting its jurisdiction. And then it will take several months to consider these before forming an opinion on the matter. So under the best of circumstances, a decision on the prosecutor's applications for arrest warrants, which was made, I believe, in May, and was expected to be decided upon over the summer, this isn't going to happen before the end of this calendar year. And it creates, I think, a window for the ICC, which is desperate not to have to deal with this issue for political reasons. Again, we're talking about Palestine, not Ukraine, is desperate to be rid of this albatross, to find a way to hatch an escape plan, if you will. And here we see again Khan and the ICC hiding behind process to evade their professional, their legal, their moral duties and responsibilities.
And we will be following that closely, of course. And I think, unlike many other cases, that this issue more than anything else, has become a litmus test for the ICC.
Very much so.
And last week we spoke about how Israel has been gaming the international system. And I think if the ICC fails to issue arrest warrants, this will be seen as another example of how Israel has gamed the international system, and it would completely discredit the ICC, ICJ for many of its problems, you could say. Last week it vindicated itself, and people around the world have some faith in that institution, having stated that Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip is illegal, and it's been consistent with the law. So in this regard, with the ICC, it's not the same situation. It doesn't seem to be anyway. So it very much is a litmus test. But let's move on to our other key story from the weekend. The rocket attack on the Druze Arab town in Majd al-Shams claimed the lives of 12 people and injuring 30 others. I want to just begin by initially getting your thoughts on the attack on Majd al-Shams before we dive into some of the other questions related to that.
Yes, well, what happened is that over the weekend, a projectile landed on a soccer field in the town of Majd al-Shams. Majd al-Shams is the largest remaining population center on the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. There were a large number of children and youths at the time playing soccer, football on this field, and 12 of them were killed, and I believe at least another 30 were injured. Israel immediately blamed Hezbollah for targeting this town. Hezbollah immediately, or very shortly after that accusation was made, denied any connection to this attack. And of course, the United States, this may even have happened before the projectile hit, came out and supported Israel's version, as always, more pro-Israel than Israel itself. Now, I should add, I wasn't there. I can't confirm with certainty what happened. The only way that can be confirmed with certainty, or the best way to have that confirmed with certainty, would be to conduct an independent international investigation that is given full access to all the information it needs to make a finding on this issue. Having said that, it is known that Hezbollah has in recent months been launching attacks on Israeli military installations in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. And so I don't think that the possibility of an errant Hezbollah missile that mistakenly hit this soccer field can be categorically excluded. There is also some evidence, and as opposed to a supposition, there appears to be some evidence that the projectile that hit the soccer field was, in fact, an Iron Dome missile interceptor that was not aimed at the field, but was misfired or lost its trajectory or whatever. And it wouldn't be the first time that this has happened with an Iron Dome rocket. The point here is that Israel is now claiming those who were killed in this attack as its own people, as Israeli citizens. They're not Israeli citizens, but we'll get into that in a moment, and has been saying that as a result of this attack and what it continues to claim as Hezbollah's responsibility for it, it will now launch a devastating reprisal against Hezbollah, against Lebanon. You've heard all kinds of statements from basically, the same people who are lauding the rapists at Sde Teiman detention center as heroes, now calling for Lebanon to be incinerated, to wipe out the population of southern Lebanon, to kill Hassan Nasrallah, the general secretary of Hezbollah, and, all the rest of the usual Israeli talking points. So this really puts the Middle East on a precipice because if Israel does engage in significant escalation in the wake of this attack, Hezbollah has been absolutely clear. Not only does it deny any responsibility for this attack, and here I should add that um, as we've seen in the past 10 months and as we've known for decades, Israel's official statements, particularly in times of war, are systematically mendacious. Of course, all governments lie during wartime, but even by that standard, the level of mendacity that we've seen from the Israeli government and its military spokespersons and so on during the past year is really on an entirely different level. It has reached depths that have rarely been explored by governments during wartime during the past century. Um, by contrast, Hezbollah's reporting about its own actions, as a rule, have been incomparably more credible than those of Israel. It takes responsibility for its actions, even where those are actions that place it in severe embarrassment. So, for example, in 2002, a number of Palestinians in the Galilee were killed by Hezbollah missile strikes. And at the conclusion of that war, in a speech given by Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, he acknowledged these attacks. He took responsibility for them. He apologized for them, and he asked the forgiveness of those affected for those attacks. So one may, it could be the case, if this was indeed a Hezbollah attack, that it's not going to admit its responsibility at this stage. But one also wouldn't expect Hezbollah to categorically denounce any connection to these killings, to then only at a later stage admit its errors in the way it did in 2006, because this would basically fatally puncture its credibility.
The response from the Israelis seems to be as far removed as possible from any response of a rational government. And if you, for example, take Benjamin Netanyahu, he's taken the cruel decision to punish Palestinian children for the attack. So there was this plan for Israel to facilitate the medical evacuation of hundreds of sick Palestinian wounded children from Gaza to the United Arab Emirates. So why would you punish Palestinian children for something that's happened on the Golan Heights? It seems really bizarre. The Physician for Human Rights organization said that this was a cruel game that's being played by the Israelis with the lives of Palestinian children. So what's the thinking in punishing Palestinian children for a attack that may have been caused by Hezbollah? And let's look at that side by side with the news that Netanyahu last week overruled an order by his defense minister, Yoav Galant, to build a field hospital in Israel to treat sick Palestinian children.
Well, from the Israeli perspective, an Arab is an Arab. They're all Arabs. The Palestinians are the most Arab of them all. All Palestinians are terrorists. And so therefore there can be no distinction between a sick or critically injured child or someone shooting long-range missiles at Israel from Lebanon. This is the Israeli thinking. It's classic racist approach to one's adversaries. And we've seen so many statements from the outset. The entire population is responsible. The entire population needs to pay the price for October 7th. Gaza should no longer exist. I mean, we even had one member of Israel's governing party calling for the Gaza Strip to be transformed into another Auschwitz. imagine. So that's where we are. And I think it also reflects, once again, Israel's military failures and frailty when you're not in a position to deal a blow to a genuine military adversary. What do? Well, you take out your rage and frustration on the civilian population, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. There's a further angle to this, which is of interest, I think, is that these sick and wounded children were not being evacuated to Egypt. They were evacuated to Israel's best friend in the region via Egypt, namely the United Arab Emirates. And it will be interesting to see how the United Arab Emirates responds to this Israeli move. I suspect there will be absolutely none, but nevertheless, I think it's something that should be kept in view. And I think it's the same logic that explains the decision by Netanyahu to overrule his defense minister about setting up this field hospital. Although here there's also another factor, which is the constant rivalry and jockeying for position between these two figures in the context of Israel's domestic war of all against all.
Let's look at the Golan Heights from a legal perspective. We saw last week the ICJ issue a judgment saying that the occupied West Bank, Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip is illegal, that those territories are occupied under international law. Israel has for decades been contesting that position, but now it's absolutely clear. No one can say it's disputed territory. It's clearly occupied, illegally occupied territory. If you were to now extrapolate and expand the judgment, would the ICJ not also conclude that the Golan Heights are also occupied Israeli territory?
Well, precisely. I mean, as you mentioned, what the International Court of Justice ruled earlier this month with respect to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, the occupied Palestinian territories, is that Israeli rule in these territories is illegal and unlawful and illegitimate because it no longer constitutes a military occupation as defined under international law, but has graduated to the level of an illegal annexation, violating the fundamental principle of the acquisition of territory by war. Israel has formally annexed East Jerusalem, has formally annexed parts of the West Bank, and it has expressed a desire to formally annex additional parts of the West Bank, and in some cases, all of the West Bank. So the International Court of Justice did not rely on the formal status of these territories alone in reaching its conclusions and recommendations in its advisory opinion. As you note, the occupied Syrian Golan Heights were not part of this case, of this advisory opinion. But given that these territories were occupied during the same week by the same state during the same war and have been, on the whole, subject to virtually identical policies for over half a century, I think it's entirely appropriate to seek to extrapolate, as you suggest, from this advisory ruling on the occupied Palestinian territories to the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. And here, I think the most important distinction is that in 1981, Israel formally annexed the entirety of the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, and it was condemned for doing so by the United Nations Security Council with American support. Its annexation was declared null and void. And in addition to that, Israel, in contrast to the occupied Palestinian territories, gone one step further and sought to impose Israeli citizenship on the Syrian residents of the Golan Heights. With few exceptions, it has been unsuccessful in doing so. But, you know, if you look at what the International Court of Justice ruled with respect to the occupied Palestinian territories, given this history, it seems to me that it would be at least as applicable to the occupied Syrian Golan Heights.
So on this, is there a slight difference in terms of Israel's right to defend itself? Because Israel again has asserted its right to defend itself following the attack on the Golan Heights. But in this case, the attack was by Hezbollah, not by Syria. Unlike, of course, in Palestine, where Palestinians have a right to defend themselves against Israeli aggression, Israeli occupation in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Does Israel have an argument when it says Israel is defending itself against Hezbollah? Of course, if Syria was to attack, say we are defending ourselves against Israeli aggression, Israeli occupation of our territory. So can Israel make that claim in this scenario, given that the protagonist is Hezbollah and not a Syrian actor?
Well, I think there's several aspects here that are worth considering. With respect to a potential Syrian attack, we in fact had one in 1973 when Syria launched a military offensive on the 6th of October 1973 in close coordination with Egypt on the same date. It was not an attack on Israel. It was an attack to seek to restore occupied territory to its rightful sovereignty. Syria and Egypt could not have been accused, and nor were they, of the crime of aggression, which is one of the most serious crimes under international law, because it was transparently obvious that the purpose of their attack was to restore occupied territory. Now, you've asked a fairly detailed question about which I'm absolutely not a specialist, but as you note, states do not have a right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter when it comes to waging war or anything of the sort against the population of the territory they occupy. What makes this case different is that this attack was not won by the Syrian population of the occupied Golan Heights. Israel claims it is Hezbollah, and Hezbollah insists it was Israel. But if we assume that it was Hezbollah, I mean, states do not have the right of self-defense against the populations they occupy. They do have the right to ensure the safety and security of their own citizens. And in the case of occupied territory, they have an obligation to ensure the safety and security of the residents of that occupied territory. Now, obviously, ensuring the safety and security of an occupied population would preclude seizing their land, building settlements on it, expelling the population, and everything else that Israel has been doing in the Golan Heights since 1967. But if Israel is indeed correct that this missile was launched by Hezbollah, it would have to make the case that somehow expanding this war throughout the region promotes the safety and security of the Syrian population of the Golan Heights, who again are not Israeli citizens.
And we should point out the Syrian Druze population in the Golan Heights, of whom I think something like over 20,000, they absolutely reject Israel's occupation. And we saw that since the attack, where Israeli leaders tried to exploit the situation, but they were basically pushed out. The Druze community did not want Israeli leaders exploiting their suffering in that manner. So you made an important point, which is the distinction between states not having right, but individuals having right. And in this case, the Syrian population in the Golden Heights absolutely reject Israel's occupation, which by itself is sufficient to say that, Israel should not be there. That's it violates their basic human rights to self-determination. Um, Moving on from there, I think. Go on.
I'd just like to make a point on this since you referred to the Syrians on the Golan Heights as being Druze. That's correct. They're overwhelmingly Druze. They may even all be Druze. In 1967, Israel ethnically cleansed the Golan Heights and expelled over 90% of Syrians who lived in the Golan Heights on the 5th of June, 1967. So it was very much akin to what we saw in Palestine in 1948-49. Those who remained, as you mentioned, were a number of Druze communities who I think even today number no more than 20 or 30,000. The Druze are primarily concentrated in Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, particularly in areas that are now Israel. And the Druze community within Israel has a very different relationship to the Israeli state. In 1948, the leaders of the Druze community in Israel made a deal with the nascent Israeli state by which the Druze would serve in the Israeli military, the only Palestinian population sector that would have compulsory military service, and in exchange, they wouldn't be expelled. And so they have a somewhat different relationship to the Israeli state than the rest of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And what Israel has done has been to kind of redefine Druze identity. I mean, the only thing that distinguishes the Druze from their neighbors, whether in Palestine and Syria or in Lebanon, is their faith. But they speak the same language, they have the same culture, they eat the same food, and all the rest of it. So they're essentially, as different from Muslim or Christian Syrians or Lebanese or Palestinians. That distinction is no greater than that between, English Protestants and English Catholics, if you will. But Israel has sought to redefine Druze identity, particularly in Israel, as somehow being a separate ethnicity or nationality, or as if somehow these are as distinct from Arabs as are, let's say, Kurds or Amazigh or whatever. And it's one that's not only rejected by many Palestinian Druze who are citizens of Israel, but it is universally rejected by the Syrian Druze who live on the occupied Golan Heights. And in 1981, when Israel formally annexed the Golan Heights, it began a campaign of imposing Israeli identity documents on these Druze communities. And there was a massive and intense and collective campaign of civil disobedience to reject this Israeli campaign. And it went on for months against, the Israelis pulled out all the stops, imposing curfews, closing, basically making these communities' lives miserable. And it was an intense, long-standing campaign that, for the record, was systematically ignored by everyone who's been whining about where's the Arab Gandhi or the Arab Martin Luther King. They had absolutely nothing to say about this absolutely heroic campaign during the early 1980s. It was eventually crushed. And the Druze, on the Syrian Druze on the Golan Heights, were left really with no option but to accept Israeli identity documents. But they have systematically rejected becoming Israeli citizens, and to this day are not Israeli citizens. They consider them Syrians. Syria considers them Syrian, and under international law, they are Syrians. And the fact that the United States, under the Trump-Biden policy, has accepted Israel's claims of sovereignty over the Golan Heights means absolutely nothing. It's akin to if they would accept British sovereignty over the Republic of Ireland. It is of absolutely no consequence.
We've not spoken about Gaza itself yet, and last week there was another round of forceful expulsion. 40,000 Palestinians were forced to evacuate from Khan Yunus. So I've lost count of the number of times Palestinians have been ordered to evacuate. And let's not also forget the constant bombing of shelters. According to Itamar Foundation for Human Rights, Israel has bombed, this is a report that came out last week, 126 shelters in Gaza since 7 October. So the more and more you look at this, the fact that Palestinians are constantly being forced out, shelters are being destroyed, and Palestinians having to be constantly on the move, it seems more and more like what many say is that this is really a war of revenge and not a war that has any clear, achievable political aim. I mean, is that really not the case?
Well, it's certainly a war of revenge, but given the increasingly systematic nature of such attacks, I think it will now be for the International Court of Justice to determine, is this merely a war of revenge, or is it also a war of annihilation? And it increasingly does conform to the definition of a war of annihilation. You have that, you have the spread of diseases, most recently Israel blowing up the water reservoir in Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip at a time when every concerned agency is issuing urgent warnings about the risk of a polio epidemic in the Gaza Strip. And so, you repeatedly order a captive population to forcibly evacuate its locations, to the extent that none other than the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has described Palestinians as having been transformed by Israel into human pinballs. And then you begin to systematically bomb precisely those areas that you claim are designated safe zones. And when you kill, dozens, repeatedly kill dozens and injure hundreds in these incidents, you say, oh, well, there was a Hamas leader there, or, oh, well, Hamas is hiding behind civilians and all the rest of it. Well, that may lead to rapturous applause in the US Congress. But it's not going to help Israel very much before the International Court of Justice, even if Israel can demonstrate that this was a case, which of course they can't, because by now I think it's transparently obvious that this is just a propaganda line so that the Germans and the Americans and the Brits can continue to claim Israel is engaged in a legitimate war of self-defense. But one last point, if I may, I think we also have to see this other development that we were just discussing with respect to the Golan Heights in the context of this issue of the now systematic Israeli attacks on so-called designated safe zones, which are really being transformed into infernos. And the value the Golan Heights story has as a diversion, given its potential for regional escalation and so on, to divert the focus and attention of the international media and so on from these absolutely horrific outrages that we're seeing now on a virtually daily basis in the Gaza Strip.
And let's contrast that with events in matters further afield in the US. So Netanyahu did deliver his address to the Congress. There was the ritual standing ovations. I lost count how many times they stood up while, as we've spoken about, there's a genocide going on in Gaza and whatnot. And that was taking place within the context of Israeli military chiefs, ex-Mossad directors, and many other ex-senior officials writing a letter to the Congress saying that Netanyahu poses, in their eyes, and I quote, an existential threat to the state of Israel because he is now fighting the war in Gaza for himself and not for Israeli security interests. I mean, did anything really surprise you watching the American political circus when it comes to Israel and the ritual standing ovation given to Netanyahu within the context of everything that's happening?
Well, before answering your question, let me just say that I simply haven't had the stomach to watch this absolutely shamelessly disgusting spectacle. So I can't comment in detail, and I haven't yet bothered to read Netanyahu's address to the Presidium of the Workers' Party of Korea. But I shouldn't say that because I would suspect Kim Il-sung would be turning in his grave out of embarrassment if he saw these if he saw this spectacle. Look, what happened here is that the leadership of both houses of the US Parliament, on a bipartisan basis, invited an accused war criminal and someone whose government is now being judged at the International Court of Justice in The Hague on suspicion of being plausibly guilty of committing genocide. He was received to rapturous applause as a conquering hero, as the reincarnation of the Messiah by this Congress. And he received, I believe, something along the lines of 40 or 50 standing ovations. And one of them was for claiming, literally, if I'm quoting correctly, I saw the outtake, for claiming that not a single civilian has been killed in Israel's onslaught on the town of Rafah in the Gaza Strip. Imagine, he received a standing ovation. Goebbels would have been envious of what Netanyahu has been able to achieve on 4 separate occasions, with his this being his 4th address to a joint session of the U.S. Congress. It's absolutely it's incredible. Well, it's not incredible. It's entirely to be expected. I suppose if I'm surprised at some level, it's that there weren't 1,000 standing ovations and only 50.
And let's end with the most likely candidates to stand against Donald Trump, which is Vice President Kamala Harris. She last week said that, well, she actually called for a ceasefire in Gaza. She said, we cannot look away in the face of these tragedies. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to suffering, and I will not be silent. So, I mean, it's kind of touched the right tone in some sense. But also, we cannot ignore that she is also in a race with Trump to prove her pro-Israeli bona fides, and it's quite, quite a sight watching both American leaders, every American presidential candidate, offering their pro-Israel credentials in the race to become leader. So, despite what she said, again, I mean, when it comes to the crunch, she's just going to be like everyone else, isn't she?
Look, I don't want to be entirely dismissive of the statements that, is Kamala even a name? Kamala Harris made after her meeting with Netanyahu. And I don't want to, entirely dismiss her supposedly frosty meeting with Netanyahu as a staged photo op, even though at many levels, of course, it is. But I would say the following. While it's true that Harris, as most vice presidents, probably with the exception of Dick Cheney, do not play a prominent role in formulating and implementing foreign policy. She is a vice president, and she's the second most senior member of this administration. And 10 months into a genocide, it doesn't really matter what you say, because if you only walk the walk, talk the talk, and then don't take a single step to walk the walk, it's meaningless, and functionally, it's meaningless. If your position does not change anything on the ground, it's meaningless. So the real question for me is not how frosty Harris is with Netanyahu, what she says about the importance of saving civilian lives after she meets him, how much Netanyahu complains about his meeting with her, but whether she, being effectively the custodian of the Democratic Party's electoral prospects, will now impose herself on Biden's foreign policy agenda and take actual meaningful steps to end this genocide. And if she doesn't, I think history will rightfully dismiss her statements this week as just so much cosmetic attempts to paper over reality and to prettify it rather than to address and change it.
That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. As usual, Mouin, it's a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much, Nassim. Good to be with you as always.
And thank you for tuning in. See you for another episode of Mouin's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and our weekly guest, Mouin Rabbani. Bye-bye.